So what Marsha Linehan realized was it's not just philosophers or scientists or scholars who learn to think dialectically. Dialectics is how all healthy adults learned to think and process. If you think about it, that makes sense because life is complex. Life is nuanced. Life is full of contradictions. Life is also full of constant changes. So therefore, dealing with life requires balanced and flexible responses. If you think about it, effective decision-making requires that you be able to think about things like cause and effect, short-term versus long-term, pros and cons. Those are all dialectical processes. We do this all the time, whether we realize it or not. For example, just think of the last time you were at some kind of business meeting or staff meeting. At a staff meeting, everyone shares a perspective, and yet by the end of the meeting, the group comes to some kind of consensus, and then you move forward with some kind of specific action items. That's dialectics in operation. But it doesn't even have to be something we do in our professional life. Dialectics is something we do in our personal lives all the time. For example, just to figure out what to do for lunch today, you will have to use some kind of dialectics. You'll probably have to think through what are the pros and cons of maybe just grabbing some fast food? What are the pros and cons of maybe just heating up some leftovers? What are the pros and cons of skipping lunch altogether and just catching up on emails? You will think through several different options and you'll come to a decision, probably in a split second. But what Marsha Linehan noticed was that psychopathology is often associated with a breakdown in dialectical processes. What would happen if you couldn't think through things like pros and cons, cause and effect, short-term versus long-term? What would happen if you couldn't see things from different perspectives? What would happen if you had a belief and you were stuck on that belief and you couldn't update that belief, even if there was lots of new evidence? That would cause problems. So, therefore, what Marsha Linehan realized was that healing from mental illness often requires a restoration of dialectics. In other words, finding the middle balance. Because as we're going to see when we talk more about trauma and the effects of trauma, trauma is an extreme situation, and trauma triggers extreme responses. So what happens to trauma survivors is a lot of times they're caught at the extremes. In other words, that's a breakdown of dialectics. So therefore, healing requires a restoration of dialectics, being able to let go of the extremes and finding a middle path again.